Welcome to the Rancho Mirage Library and Observatory. My name is Aaron Espinoza, and I'm the Library and Observatory Director. Today, the Sunnylands series, the flight plan, The Birds of Sunnylands, is brought to you by our partnership with Sunnylands Center and Gardens. They are one of our most valued community partners. Today, I'd like you to join in welcoming Janice Lyle, the Executive Director of Sunnylands Center and Gardens.
Thanks so much, Aaron. We are also at Sunnylands so pleased to have this ongoing relationship with the City of Rancho Mirage Library. We hope that many of you, and maybe you'll raise your hands, how many of you have attended a Sunnylands lecture in the past? Yes, good, thank you. We're pleased that you've enjoyed these lectures. We've been doing them now for over 7 years, and sometimes the lectures are given by outside experts, and other times we feature the expertise of our own staff. So today, we are doing just that. Michaeleen Gallagher is the Director of Education and Environmental Programs at Sunnylands. She has a master's degree in environmental policy and management from the University of Denver. She was the president of the California Association of Museums, and she has been conceiving and implementing the public programs at the Center and Gardens since we opened in 2012. This project, Flight Plan, The Birds of Sunnylands, gave Michaeleen an opportunity to be a curator, as well as a program specialist, and she was able to emphasize the research done in the Sunnylands archives and to tell the story, that archival story, in the catalog that accompanies the exhibition. And these catalogs will be available after this lecture in the foyer. It is really my pleasure to turn this podium over to my colleague, Michaeleen Gallagher, who will share the excitement of this project with you.
So good afternoon, and thank you for being here today. I appreciate the full house and the interest in this project, and I'm really excited to be able to share this exhibition today. But first, I definitely wanted to say thank you to the library and thank you to the Sunnylands staff who came here today, all of whom participated in the development of the exhibition, the catalog, the programs, and the marketing that went along with this. And I especially want to thank the culprit who dropped this in my lap, and that's Ann Rowe, our Director of Collections and Exhibitions, who usually is the one up here introducing exhibitions. So thank you, Ann, for giving me my first curatorial opportunity. So this exhibition has been a bit of a surprising experience. It didn't start out to be a contemporary photographic exhibition. It started when Anne pulled together a list of all the avian art in the Annenberg collection, and in an interest of a possible future exhibition. And then she invited me to lunch. Now, I should disclose that any process with Anne begins with food. We all know this. So we went to Favu, which is one of our favorite lunch spots, and Anne handed me a list of art and asked what I thought. There's some really interesting pieces in the collection. You can see we have 2 Audubon prints, and then these are just a few of some of the other art pieces in the collection that represent birds. Altogether, there was quite an eclectic mix, but that doesn't always qualify as an exhibition on its own. Because you need to not only have the collection items, you need to have documentation, and you need some type of a story to pull everything together. And that just wasn't the case with all of the art pieces in one exhibition. We didn't have that story that would make sense and pull them all together. So we started talking this through, and it occurred to us that we did have another collection. We had a living collection. It's a collection that gathers on the estate as both resident and migratory birds traveling the Pacific Flyway. And we'd been documenting this collection since the trust took over managing the estate, so we knew what we had. And being smack in the middle of this flyway, the collection we have massed, as you can see, is quite spectacular. Just 2 more, and then I'll move on. There are more pictures than I was talking here. Some quick background about the estate today. On the sustainability front, we made a conscious decision early on in Sunnylands to utilize it in what we refer to as a green laboratory. So the goal was to grant a level of freedom to test ideas, maintenance strategies that could help develop better methods for maintaining and preserving a significant historic site. And we began running programs and operational projects to explore this. These are some of the images from those programs and projects. So if we are mandated by a trust document to maintain this space for historic preservation purposes and as a high-level retreat center, can we also get environmental benefits from its existence, and how would that look? One way is to look for creative opportunities to produce what we would call urban ecology data, which is information gathered in environments where people populate. This starts with determining a question that we want to answer. And with birds, that would be, what birds are here? What do we need to attract them? How do we provide beneficial habitat? And how do we document this? How do we capture the data? Well, you could start a birding program, which is what we did. This served as a creative way to provide some public access and a different level of interpretation of the grounds and the desert gardens at the visitor center. These weekly walks and tours produced a bird list that is recorded on an international database called eBird. I'm a huge fan of citizen science programs, and this is a big one. Scientists began to recognize the benefit of mass public data collection, and our birds are documented and confirmed. And as of today, this program has resulted in a list including 144 bird species. Yesterday, we added another new species sightings when one of our birders, Mark Leggett, besides being able to spend apparently the morning with a group of retired Pan Am flight attendants, also documented our first Ross's goose on the property mixed in with the Canada geese. This season, we are seeing increases in the number of visitors in some of our larger species, like the white pelican, and our first documented nesting pair of great blue heron. I'm going to come back around to the importance of this as we talk about where the trust is heading. But during this process, something interesting happened. While we were doing this documentation, we discovered something fascinating, that what we were starting to do was continuing a legacy that carried forward what the Annenbergs had always intended. This exhibition was shedding light on the fact that the Annenbergs intended to create a space for birds at Sunnylands and had done so everywhere they lived. They also began documenting their favorites through art. When we were deciding how we could use these birds to tell this story, we came up, one of the ideas is always, we could cage them. And I know that sounds far-fetched, but that was actually a conversation that had occurred not for the exhibition, just to make that clear, but as part of the original design of Sunnylands. And this came about through communication. In digging through the archives, we came across some surprises. One of them was a map. And on that map, it had imagery on one corner, and it was cross-hatched, which is the missing slide, and it says aviary on it. So this is about the point in the process where my stomach knotted, and it became clear that these hash marks had identified a multi-acre, ginormous bird cage, a giant aviary. But if we look to the left of it, it also said bird sanctuary. So their hope was not lost. We just had to figure this out. So we dug a little deeper, and in the archives, we discovered a letter to A. Quincy Jones, who was the architect who designed Sunnylands. The letter's from 1963, which was at the beginning of the design and building process, and was dated May 20th, and it was from Walter. It said, "Dear Quincy, it occurred to me that you would like to see the enclosed copy," and he's referring to a letter that I'll share in a minute, "because it is my hope to incorporate a bird sanctuary in my California acreage." He actually references the word sanctuary again in a follow-up letter dated July 26, where he writes, "Please remember that I hope to fit into the property a unique cactus garden as well as a bird sanctuary." And that's the second letter. The letter Walter had included was one that had been sent to Dr. Arthur Allen. Now, Dr. Allen was the founder of the Cornell Ornithology Lab in 1911 and the first titled professor of ornithology in the United States. He's right there, the one holding the dead bird. Notice the adoring students looking on, which is pretty typical of most professorial experiences, I understand. So I'm sure this is just some natural candid shot that was captured. In the letter, Walter was requesting resources, building and design resources, in order to, and I love how this is written, afford aid and comfort to the birds native to the region. Okay, that's poetry right there. He goes on to state that 15 to 25 acres was to be dedicated as sanctuary. So Quincy likely just interpreted what he thought Walter was asking for, and being an architect, designed a solid structure where Walter could view the birds whenever he wanted. There was clearly a follow-up meeting, however, with Walter, in which he made very clear that the aviary was not what he intended, and we find a note from Quincy confirming that the aviary would be removed at his request. It indeed disappeared from all future drawings. What we don't have, unfortunately, is a record of Dr. Allen's response. And it's unfortunate because Dr. Allen at the time was 78 years old, and he passed away 8 months after Walter had written the letter to him, so that's probably why. But we do have other correspondence, and Walter really liked to go to the top experts for questions about birding. So Walter communicated with S. Dillon Ripley. He was just the head of the Smithsonian from 64 to 84. In one letter, Walter tells Ripley that a particular gardener is tasked with manning the feeders in Walter's absence to be sure it stays filled. He said that he gets a certain comfort from providing for these feathered friends. And Ripley and Walter delve more deeply, actually, into the natural history and behavior of birds than I would have expected. We do have a great conversation where philosophy meets ecology. Walter had noticed different species of flycatchers outside his dressing room in the cactus garden, and inquires why the creator would have duplication of ecological roles in the same habitat. Ripley was incredibly responsive to what Walter termed as his amateur bird observation questions, and his response is truly delightful. He tells Walter that his observation is significant because it goes to the heart of ecology. The study of the environment brings us up short immediately to the awesome realization of the diversity of climates, even so-called microclimates, as they affect the living space for all creation on our planet. You must realize that the Creator actually has allowed evolution in the case of the flycatchers to adapt several species to slightly different habitats within the geographical areas. The ash-throated, which is up there on the left, and the black phoebe on the right both range widely, as your bird guide volume will tell you, but they have different habitat preferences. The ash-throated prefers to live in the neighborhood of the saguaro belt in Arizona and over into the desert habitat in the adjacent states. The black phoebe breeds near water, along the banks of streams, cottonwoods, near golf courses, and town environments. Thus, at Sunnylands, where you have created a miracle in the desert, you have provided an environment artificially where these two species, otherwise separated by habitat preference in a delicate balance with each other, come together. So mankind influences and bends the environment to his will. Sunnylands, like Noah's Ark, has allowed these species to come together temporarily, at no risk to their future as species, each able to bend slightly with the times and circumstances. So you have provided a new microclimate for them. Who says scientists can't communicate beautifully? So we were also able to capture some memories from family related to Walter's love of birds. A 1963 cruise trip to Alaska was a memory that Leonore's daughter, Elizabeth Kabler, shared with us. She accompanied her mother and Walter on the ship Campania. And so we did a little digging, and we're actually able to find this one photo of Walter from that trip. I think it's my new favorite photo of Walter with the binoculars on the ship. According to Elizabeth, this trip was prompted by Walter's concern over the status of the bald eagle. The eagle was officially listed as an endangered species in '67, and this trip was in '63, so they were on the radar already. Just 4 years after this cruise. So it was they were already on decline and would be added to the endangered species list when the act was established in 1973. The bald eagle was one of many casualties of DDT poisoning, a broad-used pesticide that was highly effective but had some serious side effects. So it blocks calcium development in the reproductive system of birds, which thins their shells, and they would crack under the incubation process of the adults on them or the chicks moving inside them. So DDT concentrates as it moves up the food chain, so birds like bald eagles at the top were the most heavily affected. Even seabirds like the brown pelican, because it would wash into the water systems and go up the food chain that way. Thanks to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and examples set by the Civil Rights era and anti-war demonstrations, the 1960s through early 70s became a period of some environmental awakening, and we see several protections passed. Walter's concern over the possible loss of the eagles at this time prompted him to go to Alaska to see them before it might be too late. The bald eagle did come off the endangered species list in 2007, and that was after Walter passed away. But Leonore was still alive, so I do like to think that that's one of the things she let him know of first when they came together again. The eagles are doing well and are on recovery. But we do have additional records of the Annenbergs taking future trips, so he kept going back to that area. And all those pictures, there's binoculars. We know that birds were not just relegated to outside. We saw some of their art already, but there were two items that I found really interesting. At 3 of their homes, we have this chinoiserie hand-painted wallpaper that just shows up again and again. At Winfield House, the U.S. Ambassador's Quarter in England, we have the best story. The Annenbergs spent a significant amount of money doing renovations while there. It was not in prime shape when they arrived, and the Annenbergs would not have wanted to see the diplomatic house not be taken care of in the best order. So they generously used their own funds to make it so. In one particular room called the garden room, they installed an 18th century hand-painted Chinese wallpaper that was filled with vines, flowers, and birds. And this is it here. The wallpaper had been taken from an Irish castle called Townley Hall. The paper was sent to Hong Kong, where it was restored, and then sent to the ambassador's quarters to be installed. Got quite a bit of attention in England, and they were also featured in McCall's magazine. With an interview of Leonore on the upgrades and restoration work that occurred, but a lot of attention in that story went to the wallpaper restoration. And these photos are from the McCall's story. This incorporation of gardens and birds was also used at their home in Pennsylvania. In this case, it was bamboo and birds with a pink background. And when the Annenbergs built Sunnylands and Mrs. Annenberg sold the Pennsylvania home, she brought belongings from Inwood to Sunnylands, where these furnishings were featured in the room dubbed the Inwood Room. So matching wallpaper there is almost exactly the same as what was in Pennsylvania, and that's Sunnylands down in the bottom. Another piece caught my attention that's hanging in the hallway between the Inwood Room and the living room at Sunnylands, and it's a needlepoint of Winfield House, again, the ambassador's quarters in England. The needlepoint was to commemorate their time in England, and Leonore commissioned it from the Royal School of Needlepoint. This was hand done. But she and Walter curated its design. They selected the view of the house they preferred and identified their favorite flowers and birds to be included, as well as their interwoven initials that's down in the bottom right corner, and symbols from both England and the United States. The flowers chosen were cowslips, dog roses, black-eyed Susan, and lupin, which were Leonore's choices, and Walter's favorite birds were included: the Eurasian jay, the great British tit, the northern flicker, the northern cardinal, and of course, the American eagle. So all birders know that in addition to landscape, food is very important for native and migrating birds, and through the archives, we have references to Walter's installing of bird feeders at all of their homes. The 3 homes we have the most information about are Inwood near Philadelphia, Winfield House, the Ambassador's Quarters, and Sunnylands. We do have one original feeder, and that's the Sunnylands feeder. That was outside the master bedroom in the cactus garden at Sunnylands. This season, it's been reinstalled in the cactus garden. This was a gift from a niece of Walter's, and in addition to it being a feeder, a microphone was installed with a receiver going into Walter's dressing room, so he started each day listening to the birds of Sunnylands. I know, it doesn't get any better, right? Just so you know, the dressing room is part of the current tour. So if timed well, guests on our tour will hear the birds just as Walter did, but you will definitely see it outside the master bedroom window in the cactus garden. Another surprise with the story was that it was circulating that the bird feeder at Sunnylands was referred to as the Feathered Hilton. In addition to our archive diving, we discovered that the bird feeder at Sunnylands, we discovered that, In addition to our archive diving, we discovered that the story had actually migrated a little bit. Which is not uncommon when you're collecting stories and personal histories. And how we know this is we found this photo. I don't know if you can read the top. It has a clue in the picture that the one that we have might not be the feathered Hilton. If you don't see it, at the very top, there's a sign that says the feathered Hilton. So what happened was this feeder was installed at the Pennsylvania home. This was the actual feathered Hilton because we also have a letter where Walter says it is. So Walter sent a letter to Conrad Hilton, making sure he knew that he had named his feeder the feathered Hilton because it was the grandest one in the yard. So every exhibit enlightens us a little bit further. But back to the letter, the most interesting paragraph in this letter is not the name of the feeder, but what was in the feeder, which included a variety of suet, seeds, and wait for it, a compartment that contained bread and cake crumbs fried in deep fat. The birds eat better than I do. But just as a equalizer, do you see those little cones at the bottom? Yeah, they couldn't handle the squirrels any better than we could, so. This is a photo with Wallace Annenberg, Walter's daughter, just for some scale, which turned out to be very valuable to us because we do not have the original feeder, and the maker of it no longer makes it. So we do have a replica now, and it is, luckily, due to our head of facilities, Mike Rieske, he used the photos we had and did some measurements and actually replicated it, and it's now in our wildflower field. It does have seed in it, and it is using as the same way that it was used at the Pennsylvania home. We do not have bread and cake crumbs sauteed in deep fat. I'm not doing that. But we do have a variety of suitable seed options that are approved. We don't have photos, but correspondents also made reference to feeders at Winfield House in England. And so that was, so we do know that they had feeders at all of their homes. So why for this exhibit did we decide to commission a collection of photographs? Well, it turns out that we did have a model to follow. In the archives, we also have a collection of watercolor paintings of birds from eastern United States. The artist is Basil Ede, a British painter known for his skill in producing precise avian portraiture and has been compared to John James Audubon. His notoriety grew from his 1964 exhibition at the National Collection of Fine Arts, the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. He was the first living artist to be invited there for a one-man show. But before we go on to this story, I want to share the next two pictures because I found this in correspondence in the archives that referenced Basil suffering a stroke later in his life. And these photos showed something that happened as a result. Do you notice something different about the original one? He switched hands. What was amazing is Basil spent the first part of his life in watercolors, painting watercolors, and he painted those with his right hand. After his stroke, he switched to oils and his left hand. Those are the oils he was painting after his stroke with his left hand. So it's really an amazing, he went on to paint for years after that. Walter and Basil corresponded for decades on a variety of topics, and we have those letters in the archive, and they are explored more in detail in the catalog. But even though there were many side conversations, invariably they always came back to birds. We were able to get in touch with Philip Ede, Basil's son, and he confirmed that their friendship was immensely cherished by his father. The friendship became such that when Ede published his book, The Wild Birds of America, The Art of Basil Ede, which included 103 plates of American wild birds, Walter provided the foreword for him. We get to see their friendship grow through their correspondence. It began formally as Basil begins by referring to him as Your Excellency when Walter was the ambassador at the court of St. James. But later, letter salutations changed to My Dearest Walter, and they are returned by Walter with equal affection, which was really lovely to read and to watch. And they're all handwritten, which is even better. Without knowing either of them, it was just a lovely experience to see this friendship grow. So the art. Walter purchased his first painting from Ede's second exhibition in New York at the Kennedy Galleries. It was this Northern Flicker. From there, the Annenbergs commissioned 10 more paintings of Walter's favorite in Pennsylvania. This is the original list we found that Basil and Walter began with, and it had 26 birds, with the Baltimore Oriole handwritten added to the bottom. Ultimately, it was whittled down to 10 prints. Some birds were taken off for various reasons, including size, and some were combined on one canvas. But this is the final collection. There were times when Basil and Walter disagreed on certain species, but the only changes that Walter insisted on were the screech owls right here, which is, screech owls in the wild occur in two phases. They're either a gray phase or they're a red phase, which is a brown. And Basil did them in the gray phase, but Walter didn't want them in the gray phase. He wanted them in the brown phase. So through some conversations, Basil repainted them in the red phase. The other change was the robin, and this was interesting because Walter did have opinions on representation of birds, an accurate representation of birds, and they have this conversation. But he thought that the original drawing, which is here, which is not that different, honestly, but it is a little bit, they were too thin. He wanted them built up. He wanted them puffy because that's how he viewed them. So the painting had actually already been done. The only reason we could see the difference was we had the drawing. This is like a copy of the original. Basil took it back and just kind of puffed it out and then sent it back as is. So the only large-scale bird that was left in was the pheasant. Walter was very partial to pheasants. He fed them, and that was part of the orders when he left, was to make sure that corn was put under the bushes in the Philadelphia home, or in the Pennsylvania home. And so that's probably why that one stayed in. It had a stronger connection to it. But in order to scale the frames, all the other large birds on the list ended up being removed. Although they did discuss the possibility of a future collection of owls and the possibility a collection of birds of Sunnylands, but neither were completed. So that Sunnylands collection idea brings us to the present. Jump ahead a few decades, and we sort of come full circle. When we looked at photographers for this exhibition, we selected National Geographic photographer Tim Lehman, who had very much the same style of artistic representation with scientific detail that Ede had. The style appealed to Walter, but we picked Tim before we found this information in the archive. So it's hard to tell whose hand was actually guiding the process in that selection. What Walter loved about Basil's work was that he could combine the artist's eye with the scientist's method. He would photograph and sketch birds in the field first, and then he would get access to ornithology collections in museums or education centers, and he would do his detail work using these specimens. So he would take measurements, he studied them in detail, and he was able to create these paintings that artistically portrayed living and moving birds, but with feathers and fine details of the birds captured with incredible accuracy. Tim Lehman started as a biologist and then became a photographer. So where Basil would investigate collections to get the biology right, Tim, as biologist, became a photographer balancing art with science. We recognize his work in his interpretation that's what we were looking for. And so basically the same style had appealed to Walter. Just a reminder, Tim Lehman will be here next Friday at 2, so I suggest you return to meet him in person. He's delightful. Walter knew about the Pacific Flyway and that Sunnylands and an extension the Coachella Valley was on that flyway. He built with that in mind. Not wanting to get too deep in the political challenges of the Salton Sea, which is a different, bigger talk, we do recognize that at a time when habitat is shrinking, urban ecological spaces like Sunnylands are important to consider. They should be considered. The Coachella Valley is going to become increasingly significant to this flyway as the Salton Sea changes. So when natural water systems are on decline, we've created water opportunities to replace them. Now, we often do this for our own aesthetic purposes, but sometimes these combinations of our own desire to create an aesthetic, comfortable space for our own recreation offer additional opportunity to create a bigger effect. This is what the Annenbergs recognized when they were designing Sunnylands. I'm not going to suggest that the sole intent of Sunnylands was a bird sanctuary. It certainly wasn't. But a bird sanctuary was most definitely a significant consideration in the plan. And that thinking is probably what we're going to need to embrace, at the very least, adapt in the coming years. As Estill and Ripley stated, mankind influences and bends the environment to his will. I smiled last week when I was working on this PowerPoint, and I found a release of a global study that was just completed and published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The study looked at small parcels of land in 27 countries on 4 continents and determined that previously overlooked habitat that was thought unimportant because of its size, isolation, and proximity to natural habitat turns out is incredibly important, specifically important for endangered species. 2 of the birds they cited as dependent on these spaces do visit Sunnylands. And all the birds they found have ranges that have been identified not in the large land parcels, but primarily in these smaller isolated patches. So if we look at our Pacific Flyway and the breaks between water stops on the flyway, we can see that surface water in the desert is going to be important, and habitat that is managed with birds and wildlife in mind is going to be significant. What Walter started, the trust and other man-made sites in the desert, have the opportunity to carry forward, and I think Walter would have liked that. So in conclusion, with all the bird talk, the question remains, what was Walter's favorite bird? Well, Estill and Ripley might say it was the yellow-headed blackbird, which he often discussed with Walter. Basil would have suggested the great British tit, which he painted in watercolor on a Christmas card and sent to Walter. Wallace Annenberg, Walter's daughter, and Michael Comerford, their house manager, shared that Walter loved the hummingbirds, and one in particular named Mussolini the dictator, probably due to his aggressive defense of the feeder. And Leonore's daughters shared their stories. Diane Deschamps shared that he loved the egrets that would perch on the roof of the house and that birds would nest in the rose gardens. And then there's Elizabeth's cruise to Alaska to see what might have been the last of the bald eagles. Whichever bird it actually was, it was very clear that Walter just loved his birds, so much that the Annenbergs surrounded themselves in their landscape, their art, in wallpaper, and in their social interactions. And I think he would have been very happy to know that the bald eagle made its way off the endangered species 5 years after his passing. So I hope if you haven't, you'll come to Sunnylands and take a bird walk or a tour and see the exhibition and what the Annenbergs started and the trust is carrying forward. Thank you for being here and sharing your time.